The room was already thick with tension before Damian Wolf walked through the door. 30 men and women filled the Grand Council chamber, and not one of them was fully relaxed. They sat at the long table, or stood near the walls with drinks in their hands, talking to each other with practiced ease, laughing at the right moments, nodding at the right pauses. But their eyes moved too quickly. Their smiles held just a beat too long. The air in that room was the kind that happens when people who do not trust each other are forced to share the same space and pretend that they do. Damian entered without announcement. He never needed one. He was not a tall man, not in the way people imagined power to look. He was lean, with the kind of quiet physical confidence that comes not from size, but from absolute certainty. He wore a dark jacket over a plain white shirt, no tie, no badges of rank. He did not need those either. The moment he crossed the threshold, the energy in the room shifted. Conversations did not stop, they adjusted. Laughter did not disappear, it recalibrated. Everyone in that chamber registered his arrival the way a compass registers north, automatically, without choosing to. Damian Wolf had built his position over 11 years of decisions that other men lacked the nerve to make. He had inherited a broken network, a fractured council, and a reputation that had been deliberately dragged through years of bad press and worse politics. He had rebuilt it the same way a craftsman rebuilds a damaged structure, methodically, precisely, without sentiment. He had made enemies. He had also made the kind of alliances that outlasted every attempt to dismantle them, because they were built not on flattery, but on results. The people in this room knew this. They also knew that Damian was the kind of man who remembered everything and forgave very little, which was exactly why every face turned toward him, with expressions carefully arranged into welcome. He moved through the room the way water moves through a space it knows well. He shook two hands near the door. He exchanged a few words with a woman near the window who had worked for his organization for 6 years and who genuinely liked him. He poured himself a glass of water from the carafe at the center of the table and stood for a moment, scanning the room with the unhurried patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. His eyes moved across the long table, past the faces of people he trusted, past the faces of people he tolerated, and settled briefly, just briefly, on 5 individuals sitting in different corners of the room. They were not clustered together. They had been careful about that. But Damian had been reading rooms longer than most of these people had been in his world, and there was a geometry to their positions that he recognized the way a musician recognizes a wrong note. Not quite right. Not where people would naturally sit if they had simply chosen their seats by comfort or habit. He did not let his gaze linger. He turned, exchanged a quiet remark with someone nearby, and took a sip of his water. Near the far end of the room, standing against the wall with a cloth over one arm and a serving tray balanced in the other hand, a young man named Eli Soren watched Damian register what he had just seen. Eli had been in that room for 40 minutes before anyone else arrived. He had arranged the glasses. He had set the temperature. He had refilled the water carafes twice. He had done this so efficiently and so quietly that by the time the guests began arriving, he was already part of the furniture. That was the thing about Eli. He had learned early that invisibility, used correctly, was not a limitation, it was a tool. He was 29 years old. He had worked in Damian Wolf's household staff for 3 years, starting at the very bottom, handling deliveries, managing supply orders, running errands that no one else wanted to run. Over time, through sheer reliability and an attention to detail that his supervisors appreciated without fully understanding, he had moved into the role of senior server at private events. He attended meetings like this one. He stood in rooms where decisions were made. He refilled glasses and straightened napkins and carried trays. He was present for conversations that changed things, and he paid attention. Not in a calculating way. Not at first, anyway. Eli Soren paid attention because it was simply his nature to notice things. He noticed when the temperature in a room shifted. He noticed when someone's posture changed after a phone call. He noticed when 2 people who claimed not to know each other well made eye contact with the particular ease of people who had rehearsed something together. He noticed these things the way some people notice music playing in another room. It filtered in without effort, and once it was there, it stayed. He had been noticing things in this chamber for 3 years, and over those 3 years, a picture had assembled itself in the back of his mind, with the slow, inevitable clarity of a photograph developing in a darkroom. The 5 people Damian had briefly scanned were named Marcus Hale, Riven Cross, Nora Langley, Owen Calder, and Priya Danik. Marcus Hale was seated near the head of the table, 2 chairs to the left. He was a broad-shouldered man, with a careful smile, that he wore like a piece of clothing, something chosen for the occasion. He had worked as an allied partner in Damien's network for 4 years, and had, by every surface measure, been a dependable one. He was good at appearing dependable. He was even better at being present in conversations, where he could gather information without appearing to seek it. His laugh, as Eli had observed over time, always came a half-second after everyone else's. He was listening before he performed listening. Riven Cross stood near the window on the left side of the room, holding a drink he had barely touched. He was thinner than Marcus, with a sharp face and quick, precise movements that reminded Eli of a man who had spent years calculating angles. Riven was the most recent addition to Damien's inner ring of trusted advisors, brought in 8 months ago after a business collapse that he had, publicly, handled with what everyone agreed was remarkable dignity. Eli had been in the hallway outside a closed door 14 weeks ago, when Riven's voice filtered through, tight and low, using a name that Eli recognized, and that did not belong in that conversation. Nora Langley sat with her back straight, and her expression pleasant, positioned at the middle of the table in a seat that gave her a clear line of sight to both exits. She had a small notebook open in front of her, and she appeared to be taking notes. Eli, who had carried her coffee order to this room 4 times in the past 8 months, knew that Nora never actually took notes at council meetings. She photographed things. The notebook was open as cover. Owen Calder had excused himself once already, to take a phone call in the hallway. He came back looking like nothing had happened, and then 18 minutes later, excused himself again. Eli had been near the hallway entrance during the second call. He had not heard much. He had heard enough. Priya Danik was the most composed of the 5, and that, more than anything else, was what Eli found most worth watching. Composure of that quality did not arrive naturally in a room like this one. It was constructed. She sat near the far end of the table with her hands folded and a small, content expression on her face, looking for all the world like a woman who was exactly where she wanted to be, and perfectly at ease with that fact. She had spoken briefly with Marcus when she arrived. The conversation lasted under a minute, and they had not spoken since. But when Marcus shifted in his seat, she straightened slightly. When Riven moved toward the window, her fingers loosened. They were connected to each other in a way that their physical separation was designed to hide. Eli set down the tray he was holding on a side table, picked up a cloth, and moved along the wall toward the water carafe on the east end of the room. He was not thinking dramatically about what he knew. He was not constructing speeches or imagining outcomes. He was doing what he had always done, watching, noting, waiting for the moment when what he knew would become relevant. He poured water into a glass that was already 3/4 full for a man who had not touched it. He straightened a napkin. He moved toward the next chair and refilled another glass that did not need refilling. He did this because it gave him a reason to stand near the part of the table closest to where Marcus and Owen were sitting, and because from that position, he could see what Nora was actually doing with her notebook. She was framing photographs. Not a general shot, she was composing each image specifically, twice from 2 different angles, in a way that would give someone reviewing the images a clear record of who sat where in relation to the exits. Eli recognized the purpose of this because 3 weeks earlier, in a different building, he had seen Riven hand a folded note to a man whose name he had later confirmed, a logistics coordinator who worked for none of the 5 people in this room, but who had, 4 times in the past 6 weeks, appeared in places that put him in proximity to their activities. Eli moved back toward the wall. He set the cloth over his arm. He checked the level of ice in the bucket near the drink station. He had been building this picture for a long time, not because he had set out to build it, but because when you are the person everyone forgets is in the room has a way of revealing itself to you without meaning to. He was not afraid of what he knew. He was thinking carefully about what to do with it. Damien, across the room, had just finished a quiet conversation with a man near the door, and was making his way toward the head of the table. He moved with that familiar unhurried authority, pausing to acknowledge people as he passed, projecting the ease of a man who had no particular reason to feel threatened. In a room full of trained performers, he was the best, because he was not performing. He genuinely did not feel threatened. That, Eli understood, was the most dangerous thing about the situation. Damien did not feel threatened because he had spent 11 years ensuring that threats were visible before they became real. His security team was thorough. His information networks were good. His instincts were excellent. He had survived 4 formal attempts to undercut his position over the years, and he had navigated all of them with such precise control that 2 of the people who had tried had, remarkably, gone on to work for him. But his networks had blind spots. Every network did. And the particular blind spot in this case was one that no security team ever quite accounted for. The people they stopped seeing because they had always been there. A man refilling water glasses does not get flagged in a security report. A woman straightening napkins does not appear in a threat assessment. Eli Soren did not exist in any operational profile because he was not, by any standard framework, a person whose activities would matter. And that was precisely why he was the only person in this room who held the complete picture. He watched Damien settle into the chair at the head of the table. He watched the 5 adjust almost imperceptibly. Small shifts, subtle realignments, the body language of people entering a phase they had prepared for. Marcus lifted his glass. Riven turned from the window. Nora closed her notebook. Owen returned from the hallway and took his seat. Priya unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table. Eli noted the time on the clock above the door. He noted the position of each person. He noted the small, shared exhale that moved through the 5 of them like a current through a wire. He had been waiting for the right moment to act on what he knew. He understood, watching this unfold, that the moment was coming faster than he had expected. He picked up his tray. He moved toward the far corner of the room. He began, very quietly, to think through exactly what he was going to do. Outside the tall windows, the late afternoon sun was pulling long shadows across the floor of the chamber, and the light had turned the deep amber color of hours that are about to change into something else entirely. Damien Wolf said something at the head of the table, and the room responded with practiced warmth. No one glanced at the man by the wall. No one ever did. Owen Calder left the room for the 3rd time at 6 minutes past the hour. Eli watched him go. He did not follow. He did not need to. He had already heard enough of Owen's second call to know who was on the other end of it, and he had already, 3 days ago, placed the name from that call into the larger map he had been quietly assembling, a map that had no paper, no notes, no recordings. It existed entirely in Eli's memory, organized with the kind of careful precision that he had developed not through training, but through years of having nothing to write things down on, and nowhere private to keep anything if he had. When you are the lowest ranked person in a building full of important people, you learn not to leave traces. He moved to the east wall, picked up a cloth, and made his way toward the drinks table, near the window, where Riven Cross was now standing alone. Riven had his back to the room, his eyes on the view outside. His reflection in the glass showed a man thinking very carefully about something. Eli arrived at the drinks table, set down his tray, and began quietly rearranging glasses he did not need to rearrange. Riven did not look at him. Of course he did not. Eli had first noticed Riven Cross 8 months ago, the week he arrived. Most new people in Damien's circle came in with a certain energy, either eager to prove themselves or careful to appear modest. Riven had come in with something else. He had come in with the particular ease of a man who had already decided what he was there for, and did not need time to figure it out. His business collapse, the one that had made him appear so sympathetic in the public coverage, had a timeline that did not quite hold. The company Riven had supposedly been running when it failed had continued operating under a different name for 11 months after the collapse was announced. That was not the kind of detail that made headlines. It was the kind of detail you only noticed if you were the kind of person who read carefully and remembered what you read. Eli was that kind of person. He straightened a row of glasses. He glanced, briefly and without turning his head, at Riven's reflection in the window. Riven was looking at his phone now, tilting the screen slightly to the left, a habit Eli had noticed in people trying to read a message without anyone seeing the screen from the side. He typed a short reply. Then he put the phone away and turned back toward the room. His eyes passed over Eli without stopping. Eli picked up the tray and moved on. The meeting had been running for an hour and 20 minutes, and the energy in the room had shifted from the warm social performance of the early evening into something closer to business. Damien was speaking at the head of the table, walking through decisions that would need to be formalized by the end of the week. People were taking notes, asking questions, contributing their assessments. It looked, from every angle, like exactly what it was supposed to look like. A working council, doing organized work, that kept a large operation running well. But Eli had been watching the five for the full duration, and what he saw running beneath the surface of all that professional normality was something else entirely. Marcus was engaged in the meeting. He asked 2 questions. Both questions were genuine. Eli could tell because Marcus leaned forward when he asked them, and his eyes moved to Damien's face in the particular way of someone who actually wanted an answer. But between those moments of genuine engagement, Marcus was also tracking. His attention kept returning, subtly, to 2 things: the position of the door and the position of Owen's empty chair. Nora was writing again. Actually writing this time. The pen moved in the natural rhythm of someone taking dictation, rather than the careful, framing stillness of someone composing photographs. But twice, at moments when the conversation moved away from her section of the table, her hand moved to her bag, not to take anything out, just to touch it, as if confirming that something inside it was still there. Priya had not spoken in 23 minutes. This was unusual for her. In the 6 previous meetings Eli had served, Priya had contributed regularly, smartly, with the kind of commentary that made other people in the room think better of themselves afterward. She had a gift for making the people around her feel heard, while simultaneously steering the conversation in the direction she wanted it to go. Her silence now was not the silence of disengagement. It was the silence of someone who had finished the part of the process that required her to be active, and was now waiting for the next phase to begin. Owen came back. He sat down without making eye contact with anyone. He picked up a pen and appeared to take notes for approximately 4 minutes, then set the pen down and simply waited. Marcus cleared his throat once, softly. It was the kind of sound not designed to attract general attention. It was designed to transmit something to a specific person, without anyone noticing. Priya's head did not turn, but the fingers of her left hand, resting on the table, moved once. Eli caught this from 12 feet away. He had been 12 feet away, or somewhere close to it, for most of the interactions he had witnessed between these 5 over the past 3 years. 12 feet was close enough to observe and far enough to be dismissed. He had never once been asked to leave a room during a sensitive conversation. He had never been told to step outside when a door needed to close. He was furniture. He was part of the background. He was the person who made sure the water glasses were full. He had made peace with that a long time ago, not because it made him feel good, but because he understood it for what it was. An advantage that none of the people who dismissed him could see they were giving him. There was the folded note. 3 weeks ago, Marcus had passed a folded piece of paper to Riven during a smaller gathering, a dinner for 6, held in the east salon of this same building. Eli had been clearing a dessert tray when he saw the exchange. The note had changed hands under the edge of the table, smooth and practiced, in the way that people pass things when they have passed things to each other before. The note itself was gone before Eli could see its contents, but the transfer had happened, and he had filed it. There was the argument. 6 weeks ago, in the parking structure below the building, Eli had been loading supplies into a service vehicle when he heard voices from 3 rows over, Nora and Owen. The argument was brief and controlled, both of them clearly aware they were in a semi-public space, but the fragments he caught were enough. Owen had said the word timeline 4 times in under 2 minutes. Nora had said, once, with the kind of quiet finality that ends arguments rather than continues them, "It has to be before the end of the month." Owen had not responded with words. There had been a silence. Then footsteps. There was the envelope. 5 weeks ago, Priya had handed something to a man in the main lobby of this building. The man did not work here. He was not a logged guest. He was not a vendor or a contractor. He was present for 4 minutes, received the envelope, and left. Eli had been walking through the lobby at the time, carrying a delivery of stationery to the records office. He had noted the man's face. He had noted the way Priya's expression, after the man left, settled into the look of someone who had just completed a task, rather than begun one. And there was Riven's phone call, not the one from tonight, but one from 9 days ago. Eli had been in the hallway outside the East meeting room, waiting to be called in to set up for a luncheon. The door to that room was not fully closed. Riven's voice, behind it, was lower than his speaking voice, but not low enough for the gap in the door. What Eli heard was less than a minute of conversation, but it included a name that belonged to no one in Damien's operation, that Eli had not heard before, and had since confirmed was connected to a financial structure that existed several layers away from anything traceable in the normal course of business. None of these pieces, on its own, meant anything decisive. Together, They formed a pattern, and the pattern, assembled carefully in the architecture of Eli's memory, pointed in a direction that made his chest tight, in a way that had nothing to do with personal fear. It pointed at something being constructed, something with moving parts and coordinated timing, something that had been built slowly and quietly, in the spaces that Damien Wolf's security team did not think to check. He returned to the wall. He set down the glasses he had collected. He stood quietly, the cloth over his arm, and looked at the room with the calm, assessing a tension that had become, over 3 years, as natural to him as breathing. The meeting was winding down. People were gathering their materials. Damien was speaking final words of summary at the head of the table, the kind of clear, organized conclusion that signaled that the formal portion of the evening was ending, and the social portion was about to begin. Eli watched the 5. None of them showed anything beyond the appropriate expressions of people wrapping up a productive meeting, but there was a shift in them, small, almost imperceptible, that he recognized as the shift that happens when a person moves from patience into readiness. Something was coming. He did not know exactly what form it would take, or exactly when, but he was certain of the direction it was moving in. He had one decision to make. He had been turning it over for several weeks now, not because he was unclear about what he knew. He was very clear about what he knew. The question was simpler and more complicated than that. What did he owe to a man who had never once, in 3 years, looked directly at him and registered his presence? What did Damien Wolf deserve from Eli Soren? He stood by the wall and thought about this with the same quiet, methodical attention he gave to everything else. The drinks table was adequately stocked. The glasses were clean. The temperature in the room was correct. He thought about a woman named Kara Sims, who had worked in the records department on the 2nd floor, and who had been dismissed 7 months ago, on the basis of an accusation that Eli had known, from the moment he heard about it, was false. He had known because he had been present, invisible, unremarked, at the conversation that had given rise to the false version. Kara had not done what she was accused of doing. Someone else had done it, and had allowed the version of events to land on Kara instead. He thought about a man named Patrick Greer who had worked in building maintenance for 9 years, and who had been let go 3 months ago when a new facilities contract came in, a contract negotiated in a way that excluded existing long-term staff. Patrick had 3 children. He had been told the decision was financial and unavoidable. Eli knew, from conversations he had absorbed over time, that it had not been unavoidable. It had been convenient. Neither Kara nor Patrick had been wronged by Damien directly, but they had been wronged inside a system that Damien ran, in a house that Damien built, and that house had not protected them. Eli stood by the wall and felt the full weight of what he knew sitting quietly in his chest. Then he made his decision. Not tonight. Tonight was for watching and confirming, but soon, within days, not weeks, he was going to act. Not for Damien, not against him. He was going to act because the thing being built in the background of this room was something that would hurt people beyond just Damien Wolf. It would hurt the structure. It would hurt the people inside the structure who had nothing to do with the power being fought over. And Eli Soren, who had spent 3 years being invisible inside that structure, was not willing to be invisible about that. The meeting formally closed. People began to rise. The soft noise of chairs and conversation filled the room. Marcus stood and buttoned his jacket with the unhurried ease of a man who had nowhere else to be. Riven set his untouched drink on the windowsill and turned toward the room with a composed smile. Nora closed her notebook and placed it neatly in her bag. Owen straightened his collar and glanced at the door. Priya uncrossed her hands and folded them in her lap for a single moment before rising. Eli gathered his tray and moved toward the service door. He did not look at any of them as he passed. He did not need to. What Eli Soren knew, he had not gathered through strategy. It had arrived the way rain arrives, slowly, from many different directions, and in such small amounts at first that you did not notice you were getting wet until you were completely soaked. 3 years was a long time to be in the same rooms as the same people. He did not keep notes. He had learned early in his life, during a childhood that had taught him several lessons the hard way, that the most important things were the things you kept inside your own head, because no one could take those from you, or use them against you. He had a strong memory and a naturally organized mind, and over time, these qualities had become less of a personal trait and more of a quiet survival skill. He filed things. He cross-referenced without trying to. He held information in a precise mental architecture that allowed him to retrieve it cleanly and completely, even weeks or months after the moment it had been gathered. By the morning after the council meeting, he had organized everything he knew into 3 categories. The first category was what he had directly witnessed. These were the clearest pieces. The note between Marcus and Riven, the argument between Nora and Owen in the parking structure, the envelope Priya had passed to the man in the lobby, Riven's overheard phone call 9 days ago. These were facts, observed personally, without interpretation. They were the foundation. The second category was what he had heard indirectly. Fragments of conversation, names that had surfaced more than once, in contexts where they did not belong, tones of voice that were inconsistent with the content of what was being said. This category required more careful handling. It was reliable, but not complete. It was the structure built on the foundation. The third category was what he had inferred. This was the most delicate layer. He was not the kind of person who mistook inference for knowledge, and he was careful to keep this category separate in his mind, marked clearly as interpretation rather than fact. But his inferences, assembled from the foundation and the structure, had a coherence to them that was difficult to dismiss. Together, the 3 categories built something that looked unmistakably like a coordinated plan. He sat in the small staff room on the building's service level, eating a breakfast he had brought from home, and looked at the wall in front of him without seeing it. He was seeing instead the map that had built itself in his mind over 3 years. He was tracing its lines, checking its connections, looking for the places where he might be wrong. He found 2. Both were in the third category, inferences that depended on certain assumptions about timing and access. He adjusted those. He revised the picture slightly. The revised version was less dramatic, but also more solid. It was still alarming. The core of what he knew was this: 5 people inside Damien Wolf's inner circle were coordinating with each other toward a goal that was not aligned with Damien's interests. The coordination had been going on for at least 3 months, possibly longer. It involved an outside party, the man with the envelope, and whoever Riven had been speaking to on the phone. And it was building towards something specific. The word timeline, overheard twice now in different contexts, and the phrase, before the end of the month from Nora's argument with Owen, suggested that the something specific had a deadline. That deadline was, by Eli's calculation, roughly 10 days away. He ate his breakfast slowly, and thought about the most careful version of what he was going to do. He was not going to go to Damien's security team. He had considered this, and rejected it quickly. The security team was good at what it did, but what it did was physical protection and event logistics. It was not equipped to assess the kind of thing Eli had assembled, a picture built from behavioral observation, indirect fragments, and careful inference. They would want documentation. They would want formal statements. They would route everything through a process that would take time he suspected was not available, and that would expose what he knew in a way that might prompt the 5 to accelerate their timeline before the information could be properly used. He was also not going to go to Damien directly. Not yet. He had a specific reason for this, and it was not timidity. It was that Damien did not know Eli existed in any meaningful sense. He would receive the information from a man he had never registered, and however good Damien's instincts were, and they were very good, there would be a delay between receiving the information and fully trusting it. That delay, Eli thought, was dangerous. What he was going to do was continue watching, continue being invisible, and wait for the moment when his presence in a room would be the most useful possible thing, when the information he held could be delivered in a way that left no room for doubt and no time for the 5 to adapt. He had a precise sense of when that moment might come. He had been watching the 5 long enough to see the shape of how they operated. They were careful. They were patient. They were not the kind of people who made dramatic moves in public spaces. They would choose a moment that appeared controlled, that appeared safe, where the people most likely to interfere were occupied or absent. They would choose a moment that was, by every visible measure, exactly the kind of moment when nothing unusual was supposed to happen, which meant that when they moved, they would do so with confidence. And confidence, in Eli's experience, was the thing that made careful people careless in the final moment. He finished his breakfast. He rinsed the container and set it in his bag. He changed into the jacket he wore for service shifts and checked that his phone was on silent. He had 8 days, possibly 9. He was going to use them well. Over the next 4 days, Eli paid particular attention to Marcus Hale. Of the 5, Marcus was the one Eli understood best. Not because Marcus was simpler than the others. He was not. But because Marcus had a quality that made him easier to read. He believed, fundamentally, that the people around him were not paying close enough attention to notice what he was doing. This belief produced a consistent pattern. When Marcus thought he was unobserved, he became slightly less careful. Not careless, he was too experienced for that. But the precision he applied to his public behavior relaxed by a measurable degree, and in that relaxation, information escaped. On the second day after the council meeting, Marcus had a phone call in the small seating area off the building's main corridor. Eli was delivering a package to the mailroom 11 steps away, and had arrived in that corridor at a moment that placed him in earshot for slightly less than 90 seconds. He did not catch the full conversation. He caught the shape of it. Marcus was confirming something. The word confirmed appeared 3 times. He used the phrase, same as planned, once. And at the end of the call, just before he hung up, he said something that Eli heard clearly. He won't have anyone close enough to change it. Eli walked on to the mailroom. He delivered the package. He signed the receipt. He walked back. He won't have anyone close enough to change it. This sentence did several things in Eli's mind. It confirmed that the thing being planned involved Damien in a direct and personal way, not a structural or organizational one. It confirmed that whoever Marcus had spoken to was aware of Damien's patterns well enough to make an assessment about his proximity to certain people at a certain time. And it confirmed something Eli had already suspected, but had not until now been able to verify. The 5 were not planning a formal challenge. They were not going to go through any official process or structure. They were going to do something that required Damien to not have the right people near him. Eli revised his picture again. It shifted from concerning to urgent. On the 3rd day, he watched Nora Langley have a conversation with Priya Danik. This was unusual. In the months he had been observing the 5, he had seen them maintain careful separations from each other. They did not meet openly, did not travel the same social routes, did not create visible patterns. So when he saw them speaking near the East Salon at noon on a Tuesday, his attention sharpened immediately. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. He was not close enough to hear it, but he read it through their physical language. It was not casual. The body language of the 2 women was the body language of people reviewing something, not of people chatting. Priya made a gesture with her right hand, a small horizontal movement, twice. Nora responded each time with a slight nod. Once, toward the end, Priya's hand moved to Nora's arm, not an affectionate touch but a steadying one, the kind that says, stay with the plan. On the 4th day, the invitation arrived. Eli did not see the invitation itself. He heard it being discussed between 2 members of the administrative staff while he was collecting linens from the storage corridor outside the conference suite. The invitation was to a private dinner, set for the following week, framed as a reconciliation gathering. 5 guests, 1 host. The event had been proposed by Marcus and seconded by the others. It was presented as an effort to clear the air after a series of professional tensions that had been building in the organization for several months. Eli stopped moving when he heard this. He stood very still in the corridor, with a bundle of folded linens in his arms, and let the information settle. A private dinner, 5 guests, a reconciliation framing, all 5 rivals in the same room as Damien, in a setting designed to feel informal and trust-based, at a moment when the host's guard would naturally be lower than in a formal council context. He breathed in slowly through his nose and thought about Marcus's phone call. He won't have anyone close enough to change it. Private dinner, informal setting, and Damien, being Damien, would accept. He would accept because he was not the kind of man who showed fear, even when he was aware of tension. He would accept because accepting was the dominant move. It showed control without confrontation. He would accept because, for all his intelligence, he did not yet know what Eli knew. Eli set the linens down on the shelf beside him. He straightened them neatly. He thought with considerable precision about the next 5 days and what needed to happen in them. He could go to Damien now. The information was clear enough, and the timeline was defined. But the problem with going now was the same problem that had always existed. Damien did not know him. In the calculus of credibility, whose word carries weight, whose information is given serious consideration, Eli Soren, senior server, rated somewhere below the building's cleaning contractors. He could walk into Damien Wolf's office and lay out everything he knew, and the most likely outcome was that he would be heard politely and dismissed, while someone with actual authority was assigned to look into it through channels that moved too slowly. He needed a different kind of moment. He thought about the private dinner. He thought about what kind of room a private dinner produced. A small space, a controlled guest list, people who believed they were in a moment of safety, a host who had agreed to lower his guard as an act of confidence, and a server. There was always a server at a private dinner. Eli picked up the linens again and walked back toward the service area. He was thinking very carefully now, with the focused attention that a person applies to a problem that has moved from theoretical to immediate. He was not thinking about himself. He was not thinking about what any of this would mean for his position, his job, his standing in the building. He was thinking about Kara Sims, who had lost her job for something she had not done. He was thinking about Patrick Greer's 3 children. He was thinking about the people in this building, who had nothing to do with the contest of power being played out in the rooms above them. And he was thinking about what it meant to be the person who saw what no one else could see, and then chose to do nothing. He was not going to be that person. He did not know exactly what he was going to say when the moment came. He did not know exactly what form it would take, but he knew, with the same quiet certainty with which he knew everything else, that he was going to be in that room. And when the moment arrived, he was going to be ready. The dinner invitation went out on a Wednesday. Damien accepted it by Thursday morning. Eli found out through the same channel by which he found out most things in this building, a half-heard conversation near the East Corridor, a logistics request that passed through the service department's scheduling system, and the particular attentiveness he applied to any piece of information that connected to the pattern he had been tracking for weeks. The dinner was set for the following Tuesday, 7 o'clock. The private dining room on the 3rd floor, the smaller of the 2 in this building, the one used for intimate gatherings, of 12 or fewer people, with low ceilings, warm paneling, and a round table that placed everyone at the same visible distance from the center. It was the room Damien used when he wanted meetings to feel less formal. It was the room that said, by its very nature, tonight is different from the council chamber. Tonight we are all just people talking. The guest list was 6, Damien and the 5. No security detail inside the room. That was standard for this kind of dinner. The arrangement that Damien used in informal settings, guards outside, in the corridor, with the understanding that their presence in the room itself would undermine the spirit of the gathering, was part of how he managed the social arithmetic of trust. He allowed people into that room, because allowing them was itself a statement, I am not afraid of you. He had made this kind of statement many times before, and it had always served him well. Eli put his name on the service assignment for Tuesday evening. This required a small amount of coordination. The shift belonged to a colleague named Greg, who had a personal engagement that week that he had been hoping to swap out of. Eli offered to take Tuesday, and gave Greg a Friday evening in exchange. The swap was logged and confirmed by Thursday afternoon. No one asked why. Service staff rotated shifts with each other regularly. It was not unusual. By Friday, Eli was assigned to the 3rd floor private dining room for the Tuesday dinner. He spent the weekend thinking, not anxiously. He was not an anxious person by nature, and anxiety, he had learned, was not useful. It consumed the clarity he needed and produced nothing in its place. He thought instead with the same methodical attention he gave to any task, working through the details, anticipating the variables, identifying the things he could not predict, and deciding how to hold space for them, without letting them destabilize his plan. The core of what he planned to do was not complicated. He was going to be in that room. He was going to do his job. And at the right moment, the moment that the 5 had been building toward, the moment when the evening moved from performance into action, he was going to speak. What he was going to say was the part he spent the most time with. He was not going to make accusations. He was not going to produce documentation, or demand anything of anyone. He was not going to speak to Damien, or to the security staff outside the door. He was going to speak directly to the 5, and he was going to say, to each of them, the specific thing that would make it impossible for them to proceed. Not threats, not confrontation. Information. Specific, precise, personal information. The kind that only a person who had been watching very carefully for a very long time could possess. The kind that, when it arrives from an unexpected source in an unexpected moment, does not produce anger or defiance, but something much more useful, It produces recognition. The recognition of being fully, completely seen by someone you had never thought to look at. He spent Sunday going over what he had. He went through each of the 5 in sequence, and for each of them, he identified the single most precise piece of information he held. Not the most dramatic, not the most comprehensive, the most specific. The one piece that could only be known by someone who had actually been there, actually heard it, actually seen it. For Marcus, the name of the person from the phone call 9 days ago, combined with the exact phrase, "He won't have anyone close enough to change it." A detail so specific that hearing it from anyone other than the person he had said it to would require Marcus to immediately understand that he had been overheard, and by whom. For Riven, the timestamp of a call, paired with the name from the hallway, combined with a specific reference that would tell Riven exactly which conversation Eli had partially overheard, and how much of it had been absorbed. For Nora, 3 words. Just 3. The most important 3 words from a conversation she had conducted in what she believed was a private context. For Owen, a location, specific enough that only Owen would understand what it referred to, and understanding it would immediately tell him the scope of what Eli had pieced together about the logistics he had been arranging. For Priya, a name. The name of the man who had been, for the past 2 weeks, feeding information to a party that was not on Priya's side. Eli had assembled this from 3 separate fragments over as many weeks, and he was confident in it. He was offering Priya, in a single sentence, the one piece of intelligence she did not have, the one that, once delivered, would immediately shift her calculation in a way that removed her from active participation in the plan. He went over it again on Monday morning. He revised one detail, changed a specific phrase to a more precise one that was harder to misinterpret. He felt, by the end of Monday, that he was ready. He was not performing confidence. He was not trying to be impressive or heroic. He was a man who had watched something build for a long time, who had assembled what he knew into something clear and complete, and who was now preparing to use it in the most effective way he could imagine. That was all. Tuesday arrived. He came to work an hour early. He set up the 3rd-floor dining room with a focus that he applied to all his work, but with a particular attentiveness today, checking every corner of the room, noting every position, understanding the space in the physical way that he would need to understand it when the room was full and movement and timing would matter. He arranged the table. He set the glasses. He adjusted the temperature. He positioned the serving station so that it gave him a clear line of sight to all 6 seats. At 6:50, the building's service manager stopped by the room to check the setup. He looked around approvingly, told Eli the room looked excellent, and left. At 6:58, Damien Wolf arrived. He came in ahead of the others, as he usually did in his own space. He stood for a moment near the door, looked at the room with the same assessing clarity he had brought to the council chamber 2 weeks ago, and then walked to the chair at the round table that naturally positioned him closest to the room's single exit. He did this without appearing to choose it deliberately. It was simply instinct, the instinct of a man who always knew where the door was. He did not look at Eli. At 7 on the precise minute, the other 5 arrived. They came in together, not as a group. 2 entered first, then 1, then 2 more, 30 seconds apart, in the way that people enter who have not arranged to arrive together. But Eli, watching from the serving station, could see the coordination beneath the staggering. They chose their seats quickly, with the ease of people who had discussed the seating arrangement beforehand. Marcus sat to Damien's left. Riven positioned himself directly across the table. Nora took the seat between Owen and Priya on the far side. Owen's chair was angled, very slightly, toward the door. Priya sat closest to the serving station. None of them looked at Eli. The dinner began with the practiced warmth that people in these situations always manufactured at the opening. There were pleasantries. There was an acknowledgement of the tensions of the past months. Damien spoke briefly about the value of honest conversation and the importance of keeping personal conflicts from affecting the work. He was measured, as he always was. He was generous with the kind of language that is not personal, but sounds personal. The language of a leader talking to his people. The 5 responded in kind. Marcus was the most vocal, playing the role of initiator, with practiced ease. Riven contributed 2 careful observations that positioned him as reasonable and fair-minded. Nora asked a question that seemed to be about process, but was actually confirming a particular piece of information regarding Damien's schedule for the following week. Owen was quiet. Priya said something warm and brief that settled easily into the room and produced no friction. Eli served the first course. He moved around the table with the efficiency and quietness that had made him good at this job. He placed plates. He refilled water. He returned to the serving station. He watched. The dinner moved into its second phase. More substantive conversation. Less performance. The shift that happens when people have established the rhythm of an evening and begin to let the formal scaffolding drop a little. This was the phase where real things tended to surface. Eli had observed this many times. He watched Marcus's hands. He watched Riven's eyes. He watched Nora's bag, which she had placed under her chair rather than hanging it on the back as she normally did. He watched Owen, who had gone quiet in a specific way, not the quiet of someone relaxed, but the quiet of someone counting down. He watched Priya, who had been watching Damien with the composed, attentive expression of a person, at the end of a very long process, who was finally in the final room of it. Eli set down a serving dish on the side table. He checked the time. He counted 4 measured breaths. And then Marcus Hale shifted in his seat, placed both hands flat on the table, and began to speak in a voice that had changed register, from the social warmth of the past hour, into something lower and more direct. The warmth was gone. What was underneath it was precision. It was time. Eli picked up his tray. He straightened his jacket. He moved away from the serving station, toward the center of the room, not rushing, not hesitating. Moving with exactly the purposeful calm of a man doing precisely what he had prepared to do. He was in the room. He had always been in the room. But now the room was about to know it. Marcus had just placed his hands on the table. Across from him, Damien sat still and watchful, reading the shift in Marcus's tone the same way Eli had read everything in this building. Carefully, completely, without betraying what he was reading. The 5 had moved into their final arrangement. The guards were outside. The door was closed. Eli walked toward the table. The evening, as the 5 had planned it, had approximately 47 seconds left before it reached the moment they had built toward. Eli was not going to let it reach that moment. He moved past the side table. He came to the edge of the round table where 6 people sat in the golden light of the private dining room, and he set his tray down on the surface with a quiet, solid sound that was, in the silence following Marcus's tonal shift, louder than any announcement. He said, calmly and without drama, "I am sorry to interrupt." 6 faces turned toward him. What happened next changed everything. 6 faces turned toward him, and in the turning, the room changed. Not dramatically. There was no sound of chairs scraping back, no one rising, no raised voices. The change was subtler than that, and for that reason more absolute. It was the change of a room that has been moving in one direction, suddenly finding that direction blocked by something it had not calculated for. Eli stood at the edge of the round table, with his tray, and his cloth, and the particular stillness of a man who had walked into exactly the situation he had prepared for. He looked at Marcus first, not because Marcus was the most dangerous person at the table in that moment. Eli had thought carefully about this, and had concluded that the sequencing mattered enormously, and that Marcus, as the initiator, was the person whose disruption would affect the others most quickly. He said, "Marcus, the person you spoke to 9 days ago, just before the second council meeting, the person you told he won't have anyone close enough to change it. I know who that person is. I know the timing of that call. I know the name of the logistics coordinator connected to that conversation, and I know that the logistics coordinator has been operating outside of this organization's structure for the past 6 weeks." He did not raise his voice. He did not deliver this like an accusation. He delivered it the way a person delivers a fact, plainly, without theater, with the specific precision that comes from knowing something rather than constructing something. Marcus's expression did not collapse. He was too experienced for that, but something behind his eyes shifted. A quick, involuntary recalibration, the movement of a mind that has just encountered something it was not prepared for, and is deciding how to process it. His hands, flat on the table, did not move. Eli did not give anyone time to respond. He turned to Riven, before Marcus could speak. "Riven, 9 days ago, just before the council meeting, you made a call from the East meeting room. The door was not fully closed. You used a name during that call, a name I have since heard in 2 other contexts, both of which place it inside a financial structure, that does not connect to anything visible in this organization's records. I know where that structure routes, I know who built it, and I know roughly when. Riven's drink was still in his hand. It stopped being something he was drinking, and became something he was holding, gripped, not sipped. His face, which had been arranged in the composed expression he wore as a matter of professional habit, went through something that was not quite stillness, and not quite motion. It was the expression of a man whose internal machinery was running very fast, while his external presentation was trying to hold completely still. He did not quite manage it. Eli turned to Nora. The last thing you said to Owen, in the parking structure 6 weeks ago, the sentence that ended the argument, not the middle of it, was, "It has to be before the end of the month." I was working with a service vehicle 3 rows away. I heard it clearly. I have been watching the timeline since. Nora's hand, resting on the table, went very still. Not the stillness of calm. The stillness of a person who has just been told that the room they believed was private was not private, and who is now recalculating every other room they believed was private, very quickly, one by one. Eli looked at Owen. There is a location you have been coordinating around for the past 3 weeks. You know which one. I was near the corridor during your second call 2 weeks ago. The same location, the same conversation, just earlier in the arrangement. The person you have been working to keep in that location is going to be moved by Thursday, regardless of what happens in this room tonight, because the arrangement was never as secure as you believed it to be. Owen's chair had been angled toward the door. It did not move now. He did not move. He had the look of a man who has been handed the news he was most afraid of receiving, and who has discovered that hearing it is, in its own strange way, a kind of relief, because at least now the waiting is over. Eli looked at Priya last. He held her gaze for a moment. Just a moment. He let the quiet that had settled over the table stay for exactly long enough that she could feel its full weight before he added to it. Then he said, in a voice that was quieter than anything he had said before, because quiet was the appropriate register for what he was about to tell her. The man who received the envelope you gave him in this building's lobby 7 weeks ago has been in contact with a party that is not yours. He has been doing this for 2 weeks. Everything you passed through him, everything you trusted him to carry, has been going somewhere you did not intend it to go. He stopped speaking. The room was so completely silent that the air ventilation in the ceiling was audible. A faint, continuous hum that no one in that room had ever consciously noticed before, because there had always been voices to cover it. Now there were no voices. Eli straightened up. He reached down, picked up his tray, adjusted the cloth over his arm, and took 1 step back from the table. He did not say anything more. He had said exactly what he had prepared to say, in the sequence he had determined, with the precision that the moment required. He had not improvised. He had not added anything. He had not performed. He stood at a careful distance from the table and waited. What he was waiting for was what came next. Because in the work he had done over the past week, thinking through every version of how this moment might unfold, he had identified one variable that he could not fully calculate in advance. The sequence of realizations across 5 different people, each arriving at their own version of the same understanding, was going to produce a cascade. He did not know exactly how long the cascade would take, or what form it would take in each person. He knew only that it would happen, and that when it was complete, the room would be a different room than it had been when he set his tray down. The first thing that moved was Priya's phone. She had been holding it in her right hand, below the table, in the specific way of someone who has an action cued and is waiting for the signal to take it. The hand relaxed. The phone fell, not dramatically. It slipped from fingers that had simply stopped gripping with any intention, and it landed on the carpeted floor beneath her chair, with a soft, flat sound. She looked down at it. She did not pick it up. She looked at it the way a person looks at something that has, in the space of a breath, become completely separate from them. Riven set his glass on the table. This was the most deliberate movement in the room. Chosen, controlled. A small act of composure performed in the absence of larger composure. He looked at Eli with an expression that was not anger, and not surrender, and not anything that had a clean name. It was the expression of a man who had been calculating, and had just discovered that someone else was further along in the same calculation. Nora did not move at all, but the quality of her stillness changed. Before Eli spoke, her stillness had been the stillness of someone in position, ready, waiting for a signal. Now it was something else. It was the stillness of someone whose position has just become irrelevant, and who has not yet decided what position to move to. Owen looked at the door. Then he looked away from the door. Then he looked at Eli. His expression was the clearest of the five, not because Owen was simpler, but because Owen had received the most personally specific piece of information. The thing Eli had told him about the location, about the arrangement, about the security he had trusted. That information had cut directly through all of Owen's professional composure and landed somewhere more fundamental. He was afraid. He was genuinely afraid, and he was not quite managing to not show it. Marcus was the hardest to read. He had more experience than the others at absorbing unexpected information without showing its effect on him, and he was applying that experience now. He was looking at the center of the table. His hands were still in his lap. His expression was neutral. But Eli, who had been watching Marcus for 3 years, in rooms where Marcus thought he was unobserved, could see the specific quality of attention that Marcus brought to things that had just gone wrong. He was not in denial. He was not angry. He was assessing. He was already in the next phase, the phase after the thing that had been planned, and he was trying to determine what the next phase looked like. Damien Wolf had not moved. He was sitting in the same position he had occupied when Marcus began his opening statement, back straight, hands folded, weight forward in the way of a man who is listening to something he considers worth listening to. He was in that position still, and his face, which had shifted from composed ease to careful reading when Marcus's tone changed, had not changed again when Eli spoke. He had listened to what Eli said with the same complete, undefended attention he brought to everything he considered genuinely important. And now he was looking at Eli Soren. Not with recognition, not yet. He did not know Eli's name. He could not have said, if asked, how long Eli had been working in this building. He did not have any specific memory of having ever seen this person before this evening, though he must have, in the way that you pass a piece of furniture without registering it. What he was doing now was what he did when something completely outside his existing categories presented itself. He was reading it, carefully, completely, from the beginning. The 11 seconds ended when Priya moved, not toward the phone on the floor. What ended the silence was Priya placing her right hand on the table, palm down, very slowly, with the deliberateness of a woman performing a conscious act of stillness. And then she looked up from the floor and looked at Eli directly. What was in her expression was not what Eli had prepared for in any of the versions he had thought through. He had prepared for anger. He had prepared for denial. He had prepared for the performance of outrage that people sometimes produce when they have been caught, because outrage is more comfortable than acknowledgement. What he saw instead was something much simpler and much harder. She nodded once. Not toward him. Not in his direction specifically. It was the internal nod of a person who has received the final piece of information in a long calculation and has arrived, at last, at the answer. The answer was not good, but it was the answer, and there was in Priya's face, alongside everything else, the specific look of a person who is tired of not knowing. Damien said, "Stay, please." He said it to Eli, without preamble and without looking away from Eli's face. The 2 words, quiet and direct, carrying the particular authority of a man who does not need to explain an instruction because the instruction is self-evident. Then he looked at the 5. He looked at each of them in turn, Marcus, Riven, Nora, Owen, Priya, with the measuring attention of a man taking careful inventory. His expression was not anger, it was not satisfaction. It was the expression of someone who has just been shown the complete version of something he had been seeing only in pieces, and who is deciding, calmly and methodically, what to do with the complete picture. He reached for his phone. He typed 2 words. He set it down. 40 seconds later, the door opened. The man who came through it was named Clifton, the head of Damien's internal advisory operation, a precise man in his 50s, who had worked with Damien for 9 years, and who had the quality of arriving at situations exactly as ready as the situation required. He looked at the room. He registered what he was looking at. He sat down in a chair near the door without being asked. Damien said, to the 5, "What has just been said in this room is going to be addressed. That includes what each of you came here to say, and what has been said about you. Nothing is going to happen quickly, and nothing is going to happen publicly, but it is going to happen thoroughly." He paused. "Clifton is here, because what we do next requires a witness who is not any of us. If any of you want to leave, you may leave. Nothing in that corridor is going to stop you. But if you leave tonight, the conversation that happens without you will be the only conversation." He waited. The room was very still. No one left. Eli stood near the serving station, cloth over his arm, tray at his side. He was not watching the five now. He was watching Damien, because Damien was the element of the evening that had not yet fully resolved. The person whose response to everything that had just happened was the response that mattered most, and that was still in process. Damien glanced at him once. It was a brief look, the kind that carries a question that has not yet been put into words, a look that says, "There is more to understand here, and I intend to understand it, and that is a conversation for a different room and a different time." Eli met the look for a moment, and then turned back to his work. The evening was not over, but the version of it that the five had planned was over. It had ended in 11 seconds of silence, and one hand placed palm down on a table, and the quiet, absolute authority of specific information, delivered without drama, by the one person in the building that everyone had overlooked. The guards had not moved, the door had stayed closed, and the room that the five had chosen so carefully, the room that was supposed to give them the moment they had been building toward for months, that room was now doing something entirely different from what any of them had planned. It was, at last, telling the truth. What followed the dinner was slower than what had preceded it, and in its slowness, it was more honest than anything that had happened in that room before Eli set his tray down. Clifton sat by the door with his legal pad, and wrote down the things that were said. He wrote quickly, and without visible reaction, in the manner of a man who has spent many years in rooms where difficult things are spoken, and who has learned that his job in those rooms is to record rather than respond. His face gave nothing away. His pen kept moving. Damien asked questions. Not the questions of a man who has been injured and wants to know why. Those questions would come later, in private, and they would be answered by Damien himself, rather than by anyone in the room. These were the questions of a man who wants to understand the architecture of a thing completely, before he decides what to do with it. When did this begin? Who initiated it? What was the intended outcome? What were the specific steps? These questions moved through the five like a current, producing different responses from each person. Marcus spoke first, because Marcus always spoke first when the strategic calculation favored speaking. He was not confessing, he was managing. He understood the situation clearly enough to know that the person in this room with the most comprehensive picture was not himself or any of the other four. It was the server standing at the far end of the room, who had just demonstrated a depth of observation that Marcus had not encountered before, and who had, in delivering it, closed the window that the five's plan had depended on. Marcus spoke in the careful, organized manner of a professional who has pivoted quickly and is now operating in a new set of conditions, rather than the ones he prepared for. He said enough. He said it accurately. He stopped before he said more than necessary. Riven said very little. He confirmed the things that could not be denied and declined to expand beyond them. He did this with the composed precision that had always been his manner, though the composure now had a different quality. Thinner, more effortful, the kind that requires active maintenance rather than arriving naturally. When Damien pressed him on the external connections, the name from the hallway, the financial structure, Riven answered with the controlled minimalism of a man carefully measuring how much of his position he could preserve. Nora surprised everyone, including Eli, who had studied her longer than most. She did not manage, she did not minimize. She sat at the table after Marcus had spoken, and Riven had said his careful minimum, and she began talking in a way that was not the talk of strategy, but the talk of someone who has been holding a weight for a long time, and has just decided to set it down regardless of where it lands. She described her involvement completely. She described the moments when she had doubts. There had been several, and the specific ways in which she had resolved those doubts by focusing on the grievances that had drawn her into the arrangement in the first place. She used the word mistake twice. She used the phrase, "I knew better," once. Clifton's pen moved faster during Nora's portion of the conversation than it had moved during any other portion. Owen said the minimum, in the specific way that a minimum is said when the person saying it knows that the minimum is already enough. He confirmed what he could not deny. He did not elaborate. He was not angry, and he was not particularly composed. He had the look of a man who is already somewhere else in his mind. Not checked out, not defiant, but already in the next phase, already thinking through a situation that was no longer the one he had arrived at this dinner to create. Priya waited until the others had spoken. She had picked up her phone from the floor at some point during Marcus's portion of the conversation, quietly, and without making it a moment, and she held it in her hand throughout, not looking at it, not using it, just holding it in the way that people hold familiar objects when they are not ready to put them down. When it was her turn, she did not begin with the piece of information that Eli had given her, the name of the man who had been feeding her information to another party. She began somewhere else, somewhere further back, with the original decision that had put her in that room, and she worked forward from there with the slow, careful honesty of a person, trying to understand her own choices as she described them. She said the name herself, eventually, said it and acknowledged what it meant, without Damien having to ask for it. The conversation lasted 90 minutes. When it ended, Damien did not announce anything. He did not produce a verdict or a consequence or any of the formal conclusions that the situation might have seemed to call for. He said that Clifton would be in touch with each of them before the end of the week. He said that the decisions about next steps would be made carefully and communicated directly. He said, once, very quietly, that he had not expected this evening to go the way it had gone, and that it would take him some time to think through what all of it meant. He said this not as a performance of being affected, but because it was simply true, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The five left, not together, one at a time, at intervals, with the slightly dazed quality of people who had walked into a room with a plan and were walking out of it empty-handed. The coordination that had connected them when they arrived had dissolved by the time they departed, like a structure that only holds its shape under certain conditions and loses it the moment those conditions change. Clifton stayed. He and Damien spoke at the table for 10 minutes, going through what the legal pad had captured, filling in the gaps that always exist between what is said in a room and what a complete written record of it looks like. Clifton asked 2 questions. Damien answered them. Clifton made 2 additional notes and then closed the pad and set it on the table between them. Then Clifton looked at the far end of the room, where Eli was quietly clearing the table. He had been clearing the table throughout the conversation, moving with the efficient quietness of a man who understands that the work of the room is what matters, and that his own presence in the room is the presence of the person who keeps things running. He had cleared plates and folded napkins and returned glasses to the tray, and done all of this without making himself a distraction, which was the same skill he had been applying in rooms like this one for 3 years, now applied in a room that was the most consequential one he had ever been in. Clifton said to Damien, in a voice that was quiet, but not so quiet that Eli could not hear it, "That was extraordinarily precise work." Damien said, "Yes." Clifton said, "He did that alone. He told you none of it before tonight." It was not a question. Damien confirmed it anyway. "No." Clifton was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Eli filed in the same precise mental architecture where he filed everything. The organization has been missing the most complete picture it had available to it, every day, for however long he's been here. Damien did not respond to this immediately. He looked at the table. Then he said, "I know." After Clifton left, the room was quiet. Eli finished clearing. He folded the last napkin and stacked the last glass and turned off the warming element at the serving station. He was nearly done. "I don't know your name." The voice came from the chair at the round table. Damien had remained seated after Clifton left, which Eli had noticed, and had been sitting in a particular quality of stillness, not the stillness of someone waiting for something to begin, but the stillness of someone already very far into a thought. Eli set down what he was carrying. He looked at the man at the table. "Eli Soren," he said. "I have worked here for 3 years." Damien looked at him for a moment. "I know," he said. And then, after a pause that was shorter than it should have been and longer than a simple statement required, "I mean, I know now. I should have known before." Eli did not say anything to this. He picked up what he had set down and continued clearing. "How long have you known what you told them tonight?" "Most of it, several weeks. The piece about Priya's contact, about the man who had been feeding her information, I put that together about 12 days ago." Damien was quiet. "And you waited?" "Yes." "Why?" Eli set down the tray and turned to look at Damien directly, because the question was serious and deserved a serious answer, and serious answers were not given to the middle distance. "Because if I had come to you 3 weeks ago in your office, you would have been hearing it from someone you had never registered, about people you trusted, and the distance between what I knew and what you could verify would have been very wide. The doubt would have cost time. I had a sense, I may have been wrong, but I had a sense, that time was in short supply. Damien held his gaze without looking away. Were you afraid of not being believed? Yes, Eli said. But that was not the only reason. What was the other reason? I wanted to be in the room when it happened. I wanted to be the person who actually stopped it, not the person who handed the information to someone else to stop it. And I wanted the information to be delivered in a way that left no room for anyone to adjust to it. In that room, at that moment, there was no adjustment possible. Each piece was too specific, too personal. There was no version of events in which any of them could deny having been heard, or claim that what I said was incomplete, or reframe it. It landed whole. Damien looked at him for a long time. There was something in the quality of that look that Eli had not expected, not gratitude exactly, not surprise exactly, but the specific expression of a man who has just discovered that he has been wrong about something important, and is deciding, consciously, to be honest with himself about being wrong. That was very well judged, Damien said. And I owe you a real conversation. Not tonight. Tonight has been enough for all of us. But soon. I know, Eli said. I have some things I want to say in that conversation. Something shifted in Damien's expression. Not quite a smile, but something in the direction of one. The expression of a man who has just discovered that the conversation he is in the middle of is actually just beginning. I suspect you do, he said. He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and looked back once at Eli. He said the name, Eli Soren, in the tone of a man committing something to memory, not performing the act of remembering, actually performing it. Then he walked out. Eli stood in the empty room. He picked up his tray. He finished the work. He turned off the lights and walked out through the service door, and the corridor outside was quiet, and the building was settling into its late evening rhythm, and somewhere above him the decisions that would shape the next several weeks were beginning to form in the mind of a man who was seeing his own organization differently, for the first time, in a very long time. Eli walked toward the service elevator. He pressed the button. He waited. He was thinking about the real conversation, the one that was coming, the one that was going to be harder than the dining room had been, and more important. He had things to say. He had said so. He intended to keep that promise. What Eli asked for, when the real conversation came, arrived on Thursday morning in the third-floor office, and it arrived with the particular difficulty of true things said clearly to someone who has not been expecting them. The message had come through the service manager the previous day. Damien would like to speak with Eli Soren at 9, in the third-floor office. Eli confirmed the time, went home that evening, and did not spend the night thinking about it more than was useful. On Thursday morning he arrived 7 minutes early, which was how he arrived at everything. He knocked. He went in. The third-floor office was smaller than people usually imagined for a man in Damien's position. It had 2 chairs on the visitor's side of a plain desk, a window that looked over the building's internal courtyard, and walls of bookshelves that were actually used, not arranged for appearance, but filled with the slightly imperfect disorder of shelves that are consulted regularly. Damien was already there, standing by the window with a cup of coffee, and when Eli came in, he gestured toward one of the chairs. Eli sat. Damien sat opposite him, set down his coffee, and looked at him with the direct, assessing attention that appeared to be his default mode for any conversation he considered worth having fully. He said, I have spent 2 days going through everything you said in that room. Clifton's team has been working since Wednesday morning. Every specific piece, every name, every location, every timestamp, has come back confirmed. All of it. Eli nodded. What I want to understand, Damien said, before anything else, before I say anything about what happens next, is why. Not why you waited. You explained that in the dining room, and I understood it. I mean the deeper reason. Why did you do it at all? Eli had thought about how to answer this question. He had considered several versions and rejected the ones that were not fully honest, because partial honesty in this particular conversation would undo most of the point of having the conversation. He looked at Damien steadily and said, because what they were building was going to cause damage well beyond you, to the people in this building who have nothing to do with whatever contest is happening at the top of it. I care about those people more than I care about any outcome for you personally. Damien held his gaze. That's honest. I try to be. You said in the dining room that you had things you wanted to say. I am listening. Eli placed his hands in his lap. He looked at the desk between them for a moment, not from hesitation, but from the careful organizational habit of a person who wants to begin at the right place in a story that has more than one place to begin. He said, 7 months ago, a woman named Kara Sims was dismissed from her position in the records department on the basis of an accusation. The accusation was false. I know it was false because I was present, in the hallway, outside an open door, for the actual conversation from which the accusation was later constructed. The person who allowed the false version to stand did so because the true version would have implicated them. Kara Sims is not here anymore. She was not given a proper hearing. She was not given a real opportunity to defend herself. She left this building in the belief that she had been found responsible for something she did not do. Damien's expression did not change, but something in it deepened. He was listening with the complete, unguarded attention of someone receiving information they were not prepared to receive. Eli continued. Patrick Greer worked in building maintenance for 9 years. He was let go when the new facilities contract came in. I know, because I have been in rooms where this was discussed, and where the edges of the discussion were visible, that the contract was structured in a specific way that excluded long-term support staff from the retention provisions. The people who structured it understood what it would mean for Patrick and for others in similar positions. It was done because it was cheaper. It was done because no one in a position to push back thought it worth the effort. Patrick had 3 children and 9 years of reliable work in this building, and he was let go with a standard letter and a month's notice. He paused, briefly, and then said the thing that was the center of all of it. I am not asking you to reverse these situations. Patrick has moved on. Kara is building something new. What I am asking is that you understand what these situations mean. They happened inside a structure you built and run. Your authority determines, in this building, whose voice counts and whose does not. And the reason things like this keep happening, the reason they can happen without anyone at the level of this room being aware of them, is that the people most likely to be harmed by the gaps in this organization are the people least able to make themselves heard by anyone with the power to do something about it. He let this settle. Then he continued. I have been in your building for 3 years. I have been in rooms where important decisions were made. I have been present for conversations that changed the lives of people working here. In 3 years, not once has anyone in a position of authority in this organization asked what I was seeing. Not once has anyone considered that the observations of the people who move through every level of this building might be worth gathering, processing, and taking seriously. The category of intelligence that I had assembled, and that I delivered in that dining room, is not unusual intelligence. It is available every day, from many different people, in many different forms. It is available and it is not collected, because the people who hold it are not considered people from whom intelligence should be collected. He looked at Damien directly. I am not asking to be given authority, or rank, or reward. I am not asking for anything that compensates me for what I did on Tuesday, because I did not do it for compensation. What I am asking is this, that you create a real, functional mechanism for the people who are invisible in this building to be heard. Not a form to fill in that goes nowhere. Not a system that routes to someone with no power to act. An actual mechanism, an actual person with actual authority whose specific purpose is to hear from the people who see what the rest of the structure cannot see, and to do something real with what they hear. He stopped. Damien looked at him for a long time. The quality of the silence between them was the quality of a silence that is doing work, that is being used rather than simply occurring. When Damien spoke, it was without any of the protective management that powerful people usually apply to difficult feedback. He said, You have been thinking about this for a long time. 3 years, Eli said, more or less. Damien stood. He walked to the window. He stood there for a moment, with his hands in his pockets, looking at the courtyard below, and Eli waited with the unhurried patience he brought to every room he had ever stood in. After a minute, Damien turned back. He said, Kara Sims, do you have the details? Who made the accusation? Who allowed the false version to stand? Yes. Patrick Greer, the contract provision. Who structured it? I have names, and I have the timing of several conversations. Whether I have enough to be fully definitive, I would say I have about 80% of it. Damien nodded slowly. That is enough to begin. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was quieter than his previous questions but not less direct, "The mechanism you are describing, the person, the actual authority, what would that look like in practice?" Eli leaned forward slightly in the chair. This was the part he had thought about longest and most carefully. Not the confrontation in the dining room. That had required thinking. But the thinking had been finite. What to say, when to say it, in what order. The mechanism was different. The mechanism was an ongoing thing, a structural thing, a thing that would outlast any single moment or conversation. He talked for 40 minutes. He described the role, not a complaint department, not a reporting hotline, but a genuine operational function, with access to real information and a direct reporting line to the level of authority that could act on what it gathered. He described the kind of person who should hold the role, someone whose credibility with the infrastructure level of the building was established, someone the people at that level would actually speak to rather than speak past. He described the process, not forms and cues but direct conversation, regular presence, the systematic gathering of the kind of observational intelligence that he had spent 3 years accumulating alone, and incidentally. He described what it would have changed if it had existed when Kara Sims was dismissed. He described what it would have changed when the facilities contract was being structured. He described, without naming them, 2 other situations he had observed over 3 years that had produced outcomes he believed were avoidable, and that had not been avoidable, because no one with the ability to avoid them had known about them in time. Damien listened. He wrote things down. He asked questions. Not the questions of a man looking for gaps in the argument, but the questions of a man who is building something in his mind and wants the dimensions right. He asked about the reporting structure. He asked about accountability. He asked who would hold the role accountable if the role itself became corrupted, as any role can. Eli had an answer to that too. At the end of the conversation, Damien put his pen down and looked at the 7 pages of notes in front of him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I built something large, and I built it well. But I built it with people looking up, not around. You spent 3 years looking around. That is not something I can replace, but it is something I can learn from, if you will let me." Eli said that he would. Damien stood. He held out his hand. Eli shook it, the handshake of 2 people beginning something, which is different in quality from every other kind of handshake and recognizable as such from the moment it happens. Damien said, "I will have Clifton begin on the structure this week. I want you involved in the design." "I expected that," Eli said. "I expected you expected that," Damien said. Eli picked up his bag. He moved toward the door. He had a shift beginning in 40 minutes, and the preparation for the afternoon's event would need to start on time. He did not feel lighter as he left the office. He did not feel heavier. He felt the same as he always felt when a thing that needed to be done had been done, steady, clear, already oriented toward the next thing. The next thing was the afternoon's event. After that, the structure. After that, the people who needed it. He had plenty to do. The week that followed the dinner unraveled itself differently for each of the 5, and none of the unravelings looked the same. This had been Eli's specific request to Damien, made at the end of their Thursday morning conversation, when Damien had asked whether Eli had any view on how the situation should be handled. Eli had said, plainly, that he thought proportionality mattered more than uniformity, that the 5 had arrived at the same position through different routes, with different understandings of what they were doing and different degrees of culpability, and that treating them identically would be a kind of failure, a response that was clean and easy to administer, but that did not actually match the shape of what had happened. Damien had agreed. Clifton, when he heard this, had agreed more slowly, but arrived in the same place. What emerged over the following week was 5 different outcomes for 5 different people, each shaped by the specific facts of their involvement and the specific manner in which they had responded when those facts were placed before them. Marcus Hale's outcome was the one that surprised the most people who heard about it afterward. Clifton met with him on a Monday morning, 11 days after the dinner. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. What Marcus was told was this: he was leaving Damien's network, permanently, without ceremony, and without the kind of formal, public consequence that the situation might technically have supported. He was leaving cleanly. His professional reputation was not going to be formally damaged through any channel that Damien controlled. No action was being taken beyond the ending of the relationship. In exchange, Everything Marcus had provided to Clifton, the names, the timing, the full architecture of the scheme as Marcus understood it, was on record, and would be used to address the external components of what had been built. Marcus received this with the composed acknowledgement of a man who had already modeled several possible outcomes, and recognized this one as more reasonable than he had a right to expect. He did not express gratitude. That would have been the wrong note, and Marcus was too professional to strike it. He shook Clifton's hand. He left. He was gone from the building by noon. Riven Cross's outcome was different in almost every way. Riven had given the least and withheld the most during Clifton's conversations with him. His 2 meetings, one on Thursday, one on Friday, had produced the careful, controlled minimum that Riven was constitutionally suited to produce. He had confirmed what could not be denied. He had declined to expand. He had been measured and consistent, which was itself a form of information. The things Riven chose not to confirm were a map of the things he was most protecting. But the external threads that Priya had opened in her conversations with Clifton connected to structures that Riven had built, and those structures, followed carefully by Clifton's team over the subsequent days, did not require Riven's cooperation to be understood. They were simply followed, and what they led to was documented. Riven's removal from every circle connected to Damien's operation was complete. Unlike Marcus's departure, which was quiet and contained, Riven's ending was communicated in the specific way that such endings are communicated in professional worlds where what happened needs to be understood without being publicly stated. The right people came to know what Riven Cross had done, and how thoroughly it had been found out. Not through a press release. Through the particular language of a world where reputation is currency, and its withdrawal is never loud. Riven did not contact Clifton after the final meeting. He did not contact Damien. He disappeared into the professional silence that surrounds a person who has been comprehensively removed from a world they believed they understood. Nora Langley's outcome was the most complex to arrive at. After her 4 hours with Clifton, hours in which she had provided the most complete account of any of the 5, speaking with a candor that had clearly been building behind a professional reserve for some time, there was a period of review. What she had provided was considered carefully, in full, alongside the context of her involvement. She had known. She had helped. But the quality of her help had been logistical rather than originating. She had facilitated rather than designed. And her account of her own doubts, provided without prompting and without using those doubts as an excuse, had the quality of honesty that is harder to dismiss than strategic presentation. After 6 days, her outcome was delivered, a formal suspension from all active roles for 90 days. During that period, a review of 2 specific decisions she had been involved in over the previous 2 years. The review would determine whether she returned in a different capacity, or did not return at all. It was honest, and it was not easy. When Clifton delivered it, Nora received it without argument. She said, "That's fair." Clifton told her he thought so too. Owen Calder's situation was, by the time Clifton's formal meeting with him occurred, already partly resolved by forces outside anyone's control. The thing Eli had told Owen in the dining room, about the location, about the security of the arrangement he had been maintaining there, had been accurate. 2 days before the dinner, the arrangement at that location had been quietly affected by events that had nothing to do with Damien's organization. A separate situation, a separate set of actors, a separate set of consequences. Owen had not yet known this when Eli named the location in the dining room. He had found out in the 48 hours between the dinner and Clifton's meeting with him, and by the time he sat across from Clifton, he was a man who had already lost the primary leverage he had been holding. He confirmed what he could not deny. He said nothing more. He left the meeting with the particular look of a man for whom the most feared outcome has already arrived, and who is now simply deciding how to live beyond it. Priya Danik's situation unfolded over the most time, and with the most direct impact on the outcome for everyone. She met with Clifton twice, then once more with a legal advisor she had brought herself. Over the course of those 3 meetings, the full account of her involvement and her knowledge of the external network was documented in complete detail. The documentation was used to address the external parties, the man with the envelope, and the broader network that he connected to, which Clifton's team spent 3 weeks carefully mapping. Priya's formal role in Damien's organization ended. She accepted this without contesting it. What she did after her final meeting with Clifton was something Eli learned about through a message that came to him from an unexpected direction. She had reached out to Kara Sims. The message Eli received did not explain why Priya had done this or what she had said. It said only that she had contacted Kara, had told her what she knew about the circumstances around her dismissal, not from direct knowledge, but from having occupied a position that gave her a partial view of the pattern, and had said she was sorry she had not done something about it when she first became aware that something was wrong. Kara, the message said, had not been warm in response, but she had listened. Eli held this piece of information quietly for a day. He thought about it with the same attention he gave to everything, but he did not try to categorize it or file it neatly. Some things resisted neat filing. This was one of them. He sent Priya a message that said simply, "Thank you for that." She did not reply. He had not expected her to. Some actions are complete in themselves and do not require acknowledgement to be real. The external components of the scheme, the network that Clifton's team was mapping, the connections that Priya's information had opened up, the financial structures that Riven had helped build, took just under a month to address in their full scope. Eli was not involved in this process. It was work that required the specific professional tools and authority that Clifton's team had, and that Eli did not. He learned the broad shape of the outcome through the 3-minute update that Damien gave him in a hallway at the end of the month, an update that was brief and factual, and that Eli received with a simple nod, because the broad shape was enough. What mattered more to Eli than any of the external outcomes was something that was not externally visible, and that would not appear in any report or summary or formal record of the month's events. It was the way the building felt. He could not have explained this to anyone who asked. The building's temperature had not changed. Its physical structure was identical. The corridors and rooms and service levels were arranged exactly as they had always been arranged. The people who worked there went about their days in the same patterns as always: arrivals and departures and meetings and lunches and the ordinary, continuous work of a large organization doing its business. But the way Eli moved through it had changed. Not in his behavior. He was still efficient, still quiet, still the person whose primary quality in any room was attentiveness rather than presence. But the quality of his own relationship to the building was different, in the specific way that a space feels different when it knows you are in it. People knew something had happened, not the specific details. Those had been kept appropriately contained. But in the way of buildings where significant things occur, the knowledge had moved through the walls as atmosphere rather than information. Something had changed in how this building understood the man who refilled the water glasses. A woman from the records department held the elevator for him one morning and said good morning, in the tone that one uses for a person rather than a piece of the background. The head of facilities stopped by the service corridor one Thursday to ask if Eli could tell him anything about the new internal structure being built, the one that people had been hearing about in fragments. Eli said he could not share the details yet, but that it was real, and that it would be communicated properly in the coming weeks. The facilities manager had looked at him for a moment, and then said, simply, "Good," not with enthusiasm, just with the tone of someone who has been waiting a long time for something to exist. Eli thought about how many people in a building this size were waiting, in different ways, for a version of the same thing. Not power, not recognition in any public sense, simply the experience of being part of a structure that knew they were there and considered what they saw worth knowing. He finished his tea in the staff room on the service level. He rinsed the cup. He straightened the shelf by the door. He put on his jacket and picked up his afternoon schedule. He had 2 events. The building was doing its day. He went to work. Damien Wolf did not sleep well for 4 days after the dinner, and the thing that kept him awake was not the 5. He had spent the first sleepless hours on the 5, working through what he knew about each of them, pulling up his own memory of decisions he had made in relation to each, assessing where he had been deliberately misled and where he had simply not looked carefully enough. That work was important, and he did it thoroughly. By Wednesday morning, he had a clear enough picture of the operational situation to set most of it aside and let Clifton handle the details. What he could not set aside was simpler. He kept returning to the same image, the round table in the private dining room, the 6 faces, Marcus beginning to speak in that lowered, precise tone, and then the sound of a tray being set down, and a voice he had never consciously registered saying, "I am sorry to interrupt," and then 5 sentences, one for each person at the table, delivered with the calm economy of someone using exactly as many words as needed, and not one more. He had been in many difficult situations in his professional life. He had navigated challenges that would have ended most organizations, and he had done so through a combination of preparation, intelligence, and the kind of nerve that his particular work required. He had almost always been the most prepared person in any room he walked into. On Tuesday, he had not been the most prepared person in the room. He lay awake on Wednesday night and looked at the ceiling of his bedroom and thought about what that meant. Not tactically. He understood the tactical picture clearly. There was a category of intelligence, observational and environmental, gathered from proximity rather than position, that his organization did not collect, process, or value. The absence of that category had very nearly cost him something significant. The fix for that was the conversation he would have with Eli on Thursday, and the work that would follow it. What he could not stop thinking about was the other layer. The layer that was not tactical. Eli had been in his building for 3 years. 3 years. And in 3 years, Damien had looked at him. Or rather, had not looked at him. In the same way that he did not look at the water carafes, or the serving trays, or the temperature controls in the rooms where his meetings were held. Eli had been part of the background. He had been the functioning infrastructure that made the important rooms work, without any of the important people in those rooms needing to think about it. Damien had built his whole professional life on the principle that the quality of information you had was the quality of the decisions you could make. He had invested enormously in the systems and the people that gathered and interpreted information. He had built networks that extended well beyond what most people in his position considered necessary, because he understood from early in his career that the gap between what you knew and what was actually true was the gap in which the things that could destroy you assembled themselves. And he had maintained, for 3 years, a completely blind spot in a category that had been right in front of him every single day. He got up at 5 on Thursday morning, made coffee, and sat at the desk in his study with a blank notepad. He did not write anything for 20 minutes. He sat with the blank page and thought. He thought about the structure of his organization. At the top, a well-resourced, well-connected network of advisors, analysts, and operational staff who produced excellent, thoroughly documented intelligence. Below that, a series of middle layers who translated strategy into operation and operation into result. And below all of that, the infrastructure level, the service staff, the maintenance people, the administrative support, the individuals whose work made everything above them possible, and who had been, by the implicit design of the structure, configured to be unseen. That design was not unusual. It was completely standard. Almost every organization of comparable size was built the same way. The triangle of visibility, wide at the top, invisible at the bottom, was so common that it was not experienced as a design choice. It was experienced as the natural shape of things. Damien looked at his blank notepad and thought about what it cost to experience a structural failure of design as natural. He wrote a name, Kara Sims. He would have Clifton pull her file today. He had not known the details of her dismissal when it happened. She was 2 layers below the level at which he was typically informed about personnel changes, and nothing in the summary that had reached him had flagged it as requiring his direct attention. He understood now that the summary that had reached him had been shaped by the same people who had allowed the false version of events to stand. He understood that the system he had been relying on to keep him informed had been operating, in that case, to keep him uninformed. He wrote a second name, Patrick Greer. He would pull that file too. He wrote a third thing, not a name but a question. How many others? He looked at the question for a long time. Then he wrote underneath it, and who would know? He already knew the answer to the second question. The person who would know was the person whose job placed them in proximity to everything and in authority over nothing. The person who had no stake in the official version of events because they had never been included in the construction of the official version. The person who had, by virtue of being excluded from the politics of visibility, developed an entirely different and entirely uncorrupted view of what was actually happening. He tore the page off the notepad and started fresh. He began writing the outline of what he wanted to propose to Clifton and to Eli. Not a formal structure yet, just the principles, what it needed to do, what it needed to protect against. By 7:15, he had 3 pages. He was at the office by 8. He pulled Kara Sims's file before anything else. He read it completely, including the section that described the accusation and the section that described the hearing that followed, and by the time he was done reading, what he was feeling was not anger at the people who had managed the situation badly. It was anger at the design that had made it easy to manage it badly without consequence. The design that said, Support-level people are processed through a different system, with different standards, and the people at the top of the organization do not need to be involved in or aware of individual cases at that level. He had not designed this. It had been inherited. But he had not examined it either, and not examining it was the same as choosing it. He read Patrick Greer's file. Shorter, cleaner on its surface. The damage in it was in the numbers and the contract language, not in the narrative. The kind of damage that was easy to miss if you were not looking for it, and that had been structured to look unavoidable. He set both files on the desk in front of him. He sat for a moment. Then he called his assistant and said he had a 9 o'clock with Eli Soren, the senior service staff member, and that the meeting was not to be interrupted and was not to be rescheduled for any reason. When Eli came in at 9, 7 minutes early, Damien noted, which he suspected was simply how Eli arrived at things. Damien had both files open on the desk. He began with the question. He asked it directly, without softening it, because Eli Soren was clearly the kind of person to whom directness was not a gesture, but an expectation. He asked why. He listened to the answer. He held the answer, without defending himself against it, which was harder than it sounds, for a man accustomed to being the person who assessed, rather than the person being assessed. He heard about Kara Sims. He said, "I understand." He did not say, "I didn't know." That response, however true, would have been the response of a man protecting his sense of himself, rather than receiving what was being said to him. He heard about Patrick Greer. He said, "I understand." Again. He heard the larger statement, about the category of people who could not be heard by the category of people who could do something about it, and he sat with it, in the same way he had sat with the blank notepad at 5 that morning, fully, without flinching, without reaching for the nearest available frame that would make it smaller. When Eli described the mechanism he was asking for, Damien listened with a quality of attention that he applied only to things he considered genuinely important. He wrote things down. He asked the questions of a man building something, rather than the questions of a man defending something. He asked about accountability. He asked about scope. He asked how you prevented the role from becoming either a rubber stamp or a weapon, which were the two ways that oversight functions most commonly failed. Eli had answers to all of these. Thorough, specific answers, clearly the product of years of thinking, rather than the product of the past week. Damien noticed this. He noticed the depth of the answers, and what it said about the depth of the thinking that had preceded them. At the end of the conversation, he put his pen down and looked at the 7 pages of notes in front of him. He said, "I built something large, and I built it well. But I built it with people looking up, not around. You spent 3 years looking around. That is not something I can replace. I cannot undo 3 years. But it is something I can learn from, if you will let me." Eli said that he would. Damien stood. He reached out his hand. The handshake that followed was not the handshake of formality or performance. It was the specific quality of handshake that happens when two people have decided together to begin something. After Eli left, Damien sat alone in the office for 10 minutes. He looked at the courtyard through the window. He looked at the 7 pages of notes. He looked at the 2 personnel files still open on his desk. He thought about what the Tuesday evening in the dining room would have looked like without Eli in it. He let himself look at that version clearly and completely, without the natural human tendency to soften the parts that were uncomfortable to imagine. The 5, with their plan in its final phase. Damien, in the room he had accepted an invitation to enter, with his guards outside, and his belief in his own control intact. The moment the 5 had been building toward for months, arriving exactly as they had designed it to arrive. He did not think this version would have ended him. He was not that easy to end. But it would have been significant damage. Damage to the organization, damage to the people inside it, and damage that would have taken months or years to fully repair. Instead, a man had set down a tray and said 5 things. Damien picked up his phone and called Clifton. He said, "I need you to add something to what we are already doing. We are building something new, something structural. I will explain the full scope in person. The short version is this. We have been reading the wrong people for a long time. We are going to change that." Clifton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The server." Damien said, "Yes." "I had a feeling," Clifton said, "when I sat in that room on Tuesday evening and heard what he said. The specificity of it, the sequencing. I thought, that took more than observation. That took years. 3 years. Damien said. And we never noticed. No, Clifton said. We did not. There was a pause, and then Clifton said, I will clear this afternoon. When do you want to meet? 2 o'clock, Damien said. And bring someone who thinks structurally, not from the current team. Someone who can design from the outside. He set the phone down. He looked at the desk. He had a great deal of work to do. He had always had a great deal of work to do, and he had always done it. The difference was that he was going to do it now, with the full knowledge of what it had cost him not to know what a man with a serving tray had known for 3 years. That knowledge was not comfortable. He did not need it to be comfortable. He needed it to be useful. He picked up his pen and got back to work. 3 weeks after the dinner, the new council meeting was called. It was a regular meeting in every visible way. Same room, same long table, same organized agenda, the same configuration of faces that had filled this chamber for years. People arrived in the ordinary way, settled into their usual chairs, opened their notebooks, and exchanged the brief social conversation that preceded the formal start of any working session. The building's rhythms were intact. The day moved as days in this building moved. But when people filed into the chamber and found their seats, they walked past something that had not been in this room before. Against the wall, set at a careful distance from the table, but angled so that its occupant had a clear view of the full room, was a chair, not a conference chair, not the kind that lined the table, a simpler chair, with a legal pad on the seat and a cup of coffee on the narrow ledge beside it. And in the chair, already settled, already attentive, sat Eli Soren. He was not at the table. He was not introduced to the room before the meeting began. He was simply present in the way that he had always been present in rooms like this one. Quietly, completely, with the focused attention of a person doing exactly the work they are there to do. Some people in the room knew who he was. Others had heard fragments of what had happened in the third-floor dining room 3 weeks earlier. Most had heard only enough to know that something significant had occurred, and that the shape of the organization had shifted in a way that was still becoming visible. None of them were entirely sure what to make of the man in the chair by the wall, but all of them registered him, which was, itself, already different from every previous meeting. Damien entered last. He moved through the room in the same way he always moved through it, pausing at the right places, acknowledging the right people, carrying the composed authority that he wore the way other men wore their professional clothing, as something so habitual it required no thought. He took his seat at the head of the table. He looked, briefly and directly, at the chair by the wall. Eli met his gaze for a moment. Then he looked down at his legal pad and wrote the date at the top of the first page. The meeting began. It ran well. The agenda was covered with the organized efficiency that Damien's meetings had always been known for. Decisions were made. Questions were asked and answered. The people at the table did the work that the meeting existed to do. This was a room full of capable people who were good at their work, and the meeting reflected that. At the midpoint of the session, a question arose about a facilities decision that affected the support staff on 2 floors. The question had been brought to the table by a department head who had the relevant responsibility, but not the full operational picture, of how the change would interact with existing work patterns at the support level. He presented it as a straightforward implementation, a scheduling adjustment, with a 2-week rollout. Damien said, in a tone that was simply conversational, the tone of a person in a meeting directing a practical question to the right person. Eli, you would have a view on that? Every head in the room moved. Not dramatically. Not the dramatic turning of heads that movies suggest, with its noise and its performance. The quiet movement of people registering that the room has just done something it has not done before. Eli looked up from his legal pad. He said, I do. The staff on those floors have been working around a scheduling conflict related to the timing of the proposed change for about a month. It developed informally, while the formal proposal was being prepared, and the proposal does not account for it. If the change goes through on the current timeline, it creates an additional layer of difficulty for those staff members that they will have to absorb without any adjustment in their workload or their hours. I would suggest the implementation is delayed by 2 weeks, and that someone speaks directly with the people in those roles before the final decision is made, not to consult them as a formality, but to get the actual information that would make the implementation cleaner. He said this with the same quality he brought to everything. No unnecessary words, no performance. The clean delivery of a person reporting what they observed rather than constructing an argument for what they preferred. A brief quiet. Then Damien said, "Note that adjustment, please. We will delay the implementation. Can you speak to those staff members this week?" This last directed at the department head who had brought the question. The department head said yes. The meeting moved on. That was all it was. A question asked, an answer given, a practical decision adjusted. No drama, no announcement, no moment that called attention to itself. Just the meeting, running, with one additional voice contributing to it. But the room felt it. The room had the quality of a space in which something has been established, quietly, without ceremony, and for that reason more completely than if it had been marked with ceremony. The man in the chair by the wall had been asked a question. He had answered it. His answer had been used. The meeting had continued. The formal agenda concluded. Damien gave the usual closing summary, the decisions made, the actions assigned, the direction of the week ahead. Then, after a pause that was slightly longer than his standard pause before dismissal, he said one more thing. He said, "I want to let everyone in this room know about a change going into effect over the coming weeks. We are building a formal structure for internal observation and feedback, not a suggestion box, not a reporting mechanism in the way those things have been built before. A real function, with real authority, and a real person whose specific role is to be in the rooms of this organization and to bring to this table what those rooms contain that we do not currently see. The full details will come through proper communication. What I want you to know now is the reason." He looked at the table. Then he looked around it. Every person in this organization, at every level, sees something that the rest of the structure does not see. We have invested very well in gathering the knowledge of the people at this table. We have not invested at all in gathering what is seen by the people who make this building function at every other level. That is not a minor gap, it is a structural one, and it has cost us in ways that were preventable. He paused. The person who helped me understand this has been in this building for 3 years. He has been in rooms where important decisions were made. He has heard conversations that shaped the lives of people working here. For 3 years, this table did not know his name, and what that meant in practice is that the most complete picture available to this organization was being held by a person that this organization had never thought to ask. He did not look at Eli when he said this. He looked at the table and at the people around it, because this was not about Eli's moment. It was about the rooms. "It does now," he said, "and going forward, so will everyone in this room." The meeting ended. The usual post-meeting activity filled the chamber, people gathering their materials, forming the small conversational groups that always formed after a session, the gradual dissolution of the formal arrangement into something looser. Eli closed his legal pad. He capped his pen. He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold at some point in the last hour, and did not drink from it. A woman named Diane, who managed the organization's external communications, and who had been at this table for 5 years, came to stand near him. She was not the kind of person who made small talk, and she was not making it now. She looked at him with the direct attention of someone who has decided to say something and is not going to let uncertainty about the right words stop her. She said, "I have seen you in these rooms. I did not know your name." Eli said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What you did in the dining room, the version I heard is probably not complete. But the version I heard was that you walked into a situation that was about to go badly wrong, and you stopped it. With information, without anyone asking you to, and without any protection in place, if it had not worked." Eli said, "That is roughly accurate." She said, "Why?" He gave her the most complete version of the answer he had given to anyone. He said, "Because I could, and because the people who could did not." Diane looked at him for a long moment. She was not performing a response. She was actually thinking about what he had said, which was the thing he respected most in the people he observed, the willingness to actually receive what had been said, rather than immediately organize a response to it. Then she nodded, not the social nod of acknowledgement, the internal nod of someone who has decided something. She walked away. Eli sat in the chair for another minute. The chamber was emptying. The table, which had been full and purposeful and alive with the work of the meeting, was returning to its resting state, just a table in a room, holding the light from the windows and the residual warmth of 30 people doing their work and then departing. He stood. He straightened the chair. He picked up his legal pad and his cold coffee and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, and looked back at the room. He had stood in this room more times than he could count. He had stood against the wall while decisions were made and conversations were had, and the organization moved through the work of its days. He had been unseen in it. He had been the background. He looked at it now as himself. He thought about what Damien had said. It does now. 2 words that were, in their context, exactly the right words, simple enough to carry no performance, and complete enough to carry everything. He thought about the rule. The one that had been written into the record of this organization in the days after the meeting, the first new rule in 2 years, the rule that Eli had asked for, and that Damien had put into language, and that was now simply part of how this building operated. No voice in this room is too low ranked to be heard. He did not need to hear it said again. He had heard it once. Once was enough for a rule that was finally, after a very long time, true. He turned away from the room and walked into the corridor. The building moved around him, the ordinary productive sounds of a working organization doing its work. He walked toward the service level. He had 2 events this afternoon, and a preparation that needed to start on time, and a set of notes from this morning's meeting that he wanted to organize while they were still clear. He had things to do. He had always had things to do. The difference was that the building now knew he was doing them. Some rooms show you everything, if you know how to stand in them. Eli Soren had always known how. He walked on,